Hi, I'm Jan-Peter from Tank Magazine, and today I'm speaking to the poet and academic Mark Ford about his most recent collection, Enter Fleeing, which was published by Faber earlier this year. The poems take readers on a journey through London, Nairobi, Lagos, Chicago, Colombo, Hong Kong, and many other dreamscapes and stages as Ford engages with his peripatetic upbringing as an expatriate. The result is a thrilling, funny, and various collection that captures the final decline of empire and the ways in which we all try to belong. So Enter Fleeing is your most recent collection. How do you set about forming a collection?
For me, it takes a long time, unfortunately. Mine have been spread out by roughly 10 years. This was only 7 years. And it's a question of writing poems, amassing them, and then when you've got a certain critical mass, you can start shaping them into some kind of semi-coherent sense, or just create, not a narrative exactly, but this one would be a good opener and this one would be a good closer, and then they put them in the middle. There are people I admire who shape their books very cleverly, like Philip Larkin or Elizabeth Bishop. I guess I see those two as, they write very slim volumes. Mine unfortunately are quite slim. I'd love to write a less slim one, but that hasn't happened. And Larkin used to say one sad one funny one, and so in a way you're just trying to create a bit of variety for the reader.
Yeah, Enter Fleeing's definitely got a lot of variety in it. Sort of like flits between registers and scenes. But then there's also kind of a lot of memories from your childhood, which seem to be all over the world. Is there a connection there between childhood experienced in different places in different countries and this darting between registers and scenes? And
Probably. I wrote all those ones last. Those all the ones which have place and then a date. Nairobi 1963, Lagos 1967. Those were all written sort of last, actually, in terms of putting the volume together. And I suddenly had this idea of, having never been at all, or having been resistant to being autobiographical for quite a long time, and that was part of the influence of John Ashbery, whom I read and have written about, who never liked the confessional poets. And I was sort of, for a long time, had the sense that confessional poetry, or poetry about that was explicit about my own autobiography, was somehow wrong, and I had a taboo over it almost. And then I suddenly thought, well, why the heck is that? And that's a silly taboo. And I think the flitting about does come from the fact I did have this very peripatetic upbringing. My dad was in the airlines. They came in on the sort of tail end of empire. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and my sister in Lagos in Nigeria. And we would move to a different country almost every 18 months. I can't work out the economic model of this. It seems completely crazy. But we would go from, well, all the places mentioned in the book. So those are all true, more or less. Nairobi, Lagos, Chicago, Sri Lanka, Colombo and Sri Lanka, Bahrain, Hong Kong, and so on. And I think that a poet like Seamus Heaney, who grows up somewhere very rooted, writes a very kind of rooted kind of poetry, and without thinking of myself as cosmopolitan or international in any way, I just think I didn't have that sense of rootedness, a sense of belonging anywhere, and probably without me realising that inflected my kind of thought habits. And then so this time I thought, well, I might as well kind of literalise this kind of erratic, wandering style of writing poetry and connect it to my wandering, erratic upbringing. Here's a later poem in this series of poems which have the place where we lived and a year. Bahrain, 1977. On this scorched island in the Gulf, night after night, I dreamed of buying and then mastering the art of riding a skateboard. And during the long, hot afternoons, I lay under a fan and read crumbling Penguin classics. England, my England, Lady Chatterley's lover.
I read your book on Hardy, and it comes out of this sense of him feeling very divided between the city and the countryside. Apart from bringing this like wonderful variety, do you ever think about how it formed you as a person?
Yes, it does, and that was part of the appeal of Hardy, in a very perverse way, because Hardy is associated with Wessex in so thoroughly, more thoroughly, that he seems to be the most regional writer of all time, and the most kind of embedded in a kind of regional, and he thought of it as a provincial vision that was in opposition to the city. But some perverse imp in me wanted to actually unpick that illusion, and it is an illusion. It's a carefully developed and marketed illusion that Hardy kind of was this local lad who never stirred from Wessex. London was absolutely crucial to the way in which he was formed, and my own sort of interest in it was how this deracination affects his novels, and then how that, I suppose, subconsciously, my own sense of deracination, that connects with the title, Enter Fleeing, which looks like it's a Shakespearean stage direction. In fact, it isn't. Walter Benjamin made it up. He says it time and again in Shakespeare, we have the stage direction Enter Fleeing. In fact, you don't get it in Shakespeare. But it still struck me when I read that passage as very apposite, not only to my own sort of attitude to life, but also it connected with, in a sense, I don't want to use the word zeitgeist, but I've just done so, that sense in which all the time one hears of migrations, of people moving from one country to another, often economic migrants or asylum seekers, and that sense you are entering a place, fleeing from somewhere else, and that sense of being in the spotlight for a moment. And that seemed to me analogous to what goes on in a poem as well, that you enter fleeing, so to speak. And Benjamin says very, very beautifully, I think,
lovely passage.
That the appearance on stage of those who enter fleeing takes from this its hidden meaning. Our reading of this formula is imbued with expectation of a place, a light, a footlight glare, in which our flight through life may be likewise sheltered in the presence of onlooking strangers. That notion of being sheltered in the presence of onlooking strangers seems to me terrifically humane and kind and gentle, and almost true of how we each have our, our moment in which we need a kind of kindness from onlooking strangers. And I think I came up with that at the time that the Syrian refugee crisis was at its most extreme, and Angela Merkel was letting in lots of refugees to Germany, and Benjamin being German, it somehow connected with an idealistic notion of the attitude which she was displaying to some extent. It didn't last all that long, and that seemed to me also analogous to what you do when you write a poem with personal material. You ask the onlooking stranger somehow to be relatively compassionate towards, not to be too critical of you, and that seems to me almost how we absorb information, not only through poetry, but in the kind of media age, or sort of generally.
The other onlookers that I really love in the collection are the mysterious aristocratic types in the airports at the viewing decks, looking down over everyone, rushing around, whereas they're kind of jaded and no longer want to enrich themselves. That's from Baudelaire poem, right? Straight
from Baudelaire's Laporte. Yeah. I mean, I do quite a bit of that in this book. I kind of carpenter, and I did in my previous one as well, yeah. 6 Children, carpenter bits translated from Lucretius or Baudelaire or Pliny, together with my own stuff. And I suppose that links back to the Benjamin. Benjamin was the great kind of creator of Baudelaire in some ways, or he created our sense of Baudelaire in the most brilliant of ways. But Baudelaire's kind of flaneurism and aristocracy involved not travelling. He only travelled once, and he hated it. He jumped ship and went back to France because he couldn't cope with the idea of travelling. So we think of his exotic places, but they're all exotic places of the mind. I did actually go to all these places. I was just going through stuff and found my Junior Jet Club logbook just this morning, which has the details of all these different places we went to, and my dad recorded them all. So that sense of, and we felt in that period, the 60s, very kind of privileged and excited to be travelling around the world. That was kind of inculcated into us, that going to all these different places and having a Junior Jet Club logbook which recorded flying to all these miles was exciting. Looking back on it, I can see how it connects with the tail end of empire, as well as the kind of nascent globalization. So historically, in terms of its context, I have more nuanced views of this kind of expatriation. Mm-hmm. Most of my childhood was as an expatriate.
I'd also like to talk about how you view prose and relate that to your poetry, because, I mean, obviously what a loft is from a Baudelaire prose poem. And there's a certain prosiness to some of your poems. The sentences run very smoothly when I think they're supposed to.
Well, I have experimented with prose poems a bit in the last 2 volumes. They're not sort of specific prose. The idea of writing a prose poem kind of fills me with both anxiety and tedium, I suppose. It's not for me. But I had a dream about Hart Crane being alive, and I wrote a kind of a letter to a literary editor claiming that Hart Crane was still alive in 6 Children. And in this book as well, there are kind of sections which are in prose, and there's one in this book called Fide et Litteris, which ends with again it's a dream poem. It relates to Hölderlin, the German poet, and there's a bit of a prose poem about Hölderlin in one of the poems in 6 Children as well. So there's a kind of connection there, and it is very liberating writing just a little bit in prose. And I take it as a compliment. They sound prosy in that these days I agonise, endlessly about trying to get them to sound natural and kind of as if they were prose, but not be chopped up prose. And because I don't kind of use rhyme or conventional meters that much, it's a hunch of where you break the line and how you kind of create an exciting pattern of sounds within the poem that somehow propel it, but also make it seem not precious or artificial or worked up or somehow artificial.
I like the way in lots of the poems when you're sort of travelling around, you're not the flaneur because you're not distanced and necessarily intellectualising things. People that you come across come into your reality in very sort of, you get mugged at one point, for example, or you get was it drugged on the train in Spain.
Yeah.
What's special about these moments? Obviously they are shocking or...
Yeah. Well, they are true. They happened in 1984. Both of them happened quite within a couple of months of each other. And I suppose I've never written about them before, again through evading the sort of autobiographical impulse, but I looking back from a distance, I can see it's quite a nice take on the flaneur. The flaneur is often criticised as being somehow aristocratic and lordly in the Baudelairean way, as somehow taking a disdainful, almost contemptuous look at kind of modernity and consumption and so on. But my flaneur tends to be more of a victim. He enters fleeing, more of a victim than a kind of someone who is appropriating perceptions and translating them into poetry. So that sense of undoing the flaneur trope a bit and showing how when I try and sort of have some exotic experiences, they end up mugging me. And I was drugged on the train from Barcelona to Madrid. It was very precise in that poem what happens. They gave me a cup and I saw at the bottom of it, they said, 2 Moroccan guys said, drink from this, And I thought, they're drinking from the bottle, why am I drinking from the cup? Anyway, I thought it was some kind of politeness, kind of a sort of Moroccan culture that the guest or stranger should drink from the cup, which I did. And then I saw these little tea leaves at the bottom of it, and that was the last thing I saw. And I was particularly, I couldn't wake up even after arriving at the station for a long time. But what was sort of amazing about the experience was described in the poem, that this guy took my shoes but left me his. I had some new Reeboks and he had some old Adidas Rom, and I rather preferred his Adidas Rom in the end. I thought this is not such a bad trade. They were a bit big, but I didn't wear them for quite a long time, and I thought of him wearing mine, and it created, I suppose, what Benjamin would call this doppelganger effect of this somebody else who was travelling around, coming from Morocco to Spain, wearing my shoes, and I was wearing his shoes, and we had very different lives, but somehow we had intersected at this moment.
Yeah, it's not, the detail of the shoes is great. It's also I like the way in the notes, for example, you have to explain the German sports company Adidas, and you have to explain also Theo Walcott, who played for Arsenal. What's the kind of these kind of more contemporary references that aren't necessarily literary?
Yeah.
Is that when you bring them in quite a lot? There's a lot of song lyrics. There's Sting being venomous. Is that just being true to your experience, or are you ever trying to do something with those kind of?
I think a bit of both. I mean, the Theo Walcott one came in when I read a piece about how fighters for ISIS, corpses of British fighters who'd gone over to fight for ISIS, were being found with tattoos of English football clubs. on their bodies, and that seemed to me an interesting tribal. The poem is called Tribal.
Yeah.
Creates an interesting connection between what tribe do you belong to? You're an Arsenal supporter and an ISIS supporter. There's a kind of Venn diagram with not many people in the middle of it, but one or two. And I think I also like the sense there's a reference to Boris bikes as well, of somehow almost deliberately creating, in the unlikely event these poems will be read in the distant future, someone will have to look up and find out what a Boris bike is and do a little note on it. So I preempted them a bit with doing some of my own notes, but also in that sense getting the poem out of the ivory tower, getting the poem somehow enmeshed in kind of contemporary discourse seemed to me to aerate it a bit.
You've edited a lot of poets and collections. How does working as an editor influence writing as a poet?
Well, they're different activities, same with literary criticism. They're genres, and they sort of deal with different bits of the brain. I think, in a general way, I'm a kind of magpie poet in that things I read sort of stick in my... As I'm reading someone else's stuff, something will stick in there and sink into my subconscious. Or I'll almost appropriate it more kind of, flagrantly as I read it. I think that'll look good in a poem, and I sort of transport it straight away into a notebook and try and work it into a poem. The editing I've done has been choosing the best poems, often of Allen Ginsberg, of Frank O'Hara, of Mick Imler, of London as well, and that you just go on your nerve, to borrow O'Hara's phrase. You just choose ones that you like and that you feel other people might like, and you want to get variety and so on. It's good for me that it in that you read poems you wouldn't otherwise read. The London book in particular, which came out really nice big solid book that takes you from Gower through to Aaron Warner, of a range, and it's really only a range of London poems, but that is very characteristic of London itself, that it's got this vast, this cosmopolitan kind of culture going back many centuries. And the poems, I was struck by how nearly all the poems are written by people like Hardy who come to London from somewhere else. Very few poets, there's John Donne, John Keats, Milton were born in London. The rest came from other places. Actually, annoyingly, the ones who were born in London often didn't write about London in any specific way.
I'm a big Hardy fan, and there's one poem, A Broken Appointment, that is named after... It's not adapted, but it's kind of playing with the Hardy poem. It
is. That poem was written in 1893, and it was about Florence Henniker, who was one of these well-born, quite aristocratic women who were also interested in literature, whom Hardy kind of had flirtations with, and they were supposed to meet outside the British Museum, and she didn't show up, and he wrote the poem A Broken Appointment, lamenting the fact that she didn't have the loving kindness to show up. And it's in that poem he describes himself as a time-torn man. And I call my poem is about a completely another broken appointment. Again, it's a sort of true story. I got an envelope with two tickets to Paris Nord for one going out on a Friday, and is it a Friday? Yes.
It's a
Friday,
the 12th of the 12th.
Yeah, coming back on the Saturday with a postcard in it inviting me to accompany this person. I have no idea who this person was. But it was a genuine envelope, and I couldn't even tell from the postmark. So it could have been a prank, I guess, but it's an expensive prank to buy Eurostar tickets, or someone anyway somewhere out there fancied a night in Paris with me, which was very flattering. But I'm happily married.
You have no idea who it was.
I've no idea who it was. I actually I thought it was worth kind of recording, I think also because of the ways in which the Hardy connection is the ways in which unfulfilled desire is so important for Hardy's poems, that if Florence Henniker had agreed to sleep with him, which it was never on the cards, he wouldn't have written A Broken Appointment or the other poems about it, and how much his imagination thrived on these often fantasy-fueled encounters with younger women. And Emma obviously didn't like this side of things, and it doesn't happen much in my life, but here was an occasion in which I could kind of imagine myself into Hardy's shoes in relation to a kind of a potential erotic encounter, which didn't happen.
I thought you'd been sent the tickets just from someone in Paris, and you knew who they were and you'd broken the appointment.
No,
But I prefer the reality.
it's completely mystery to me. I just sent that envelope along with a lot of my notebooks and papers to an American book dealer who's kind of negotiating and to deposit them in an American archive, and maybe some researcher in the future will find this envelope and be able to track down who the person was, or maybe they'll be listening to this podcast, who knows.
Maybe.
A broken appointment. I opened the envelope. It contained a ticket in my name from London St Pancras to Paris Nord, departing at 9:17 on the 12th of the 12th, a Friday. Coach 3, seat 27, non-smoking. And another for returning the following day at 13 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, dans l'après-midi. And a postcard of Pierre Bonnard's Le Bol de Lait, and there was just one word on the back, come, followed by an X. Whenever I pour a dish of milk or dwell on the loop in the sea of her unfamiliar hand, I can't help thinking, oh, what a poem Thomas Hardy might have written about this.
One of the last poems is about you meeting Allen Ginsberg in Oxford. Would you like to talk about that? I'd like to
yes,
know about,
that was
I'd
all
love to know more
absolutely
about
true.
that.
I mean, it's another of those poems which I just thought, what do I remember about Oxford when I was there as a graduate student, and it was meeting Allen Ginsberg, and I was supposed to interview him for a magazine called Oxford Poetry, which I was an editor of, and I set it up, which wasn't that easy, and I went out to meet him at Oxford radio station, BBC Oxford, and it was great to see Alan there. He had his little bongo shakers, I think Aboriginal shakers, and was doing a poem against the bomb during the radio broadcast. Then he came out and I said, I'm Mark Ford, I am delighted to meet you, and I'm going to interview you, and he sort of looked at me. I was wearing a leather jacket and I was quite young. So this again, I suppose, is a failed erotic encounter. And he immediately produced this box of photographs of himself in bed with a young, much younger blonde guy, and we looked at these before we'd even sort of talked to each other. We went through these, and I nodded and said, "Gosh, that's well done, Alan." And it was sort of went on like that all day. He was kind of relentless in his pursuit of young guys, and it was but it was a wonderful experience in lots of ways, because he was Allen Ginsberg, you know, and all the awe, and I wanted to talk about Bob Dylan in the 60s and things like that, and he was more keen to talk about Zen Buddhism and other topics, but he gave a terrific performance in the evening as well. But I suppose I was struck by the almost sublime egotism that he kind of displayed, and I kind of admired it and felt very different from it, and somehow thought, well, that's what it takes to become Allen Ginsberg. Oxford, 1985. Oh, to recapture the golden summer I met Allen Ginsberg. That tireless man, he had within minutes produced a whole box of photographs of himself, all shaggy and naked, in bed with a blonde admirer. Had he taken these pictures himself? I inquired, marvelling at their composition. He had.
What I liked about that is it comes straight after this "Well, we must be for ourselves in the long run" by Emily Bronte, which is kind of like less egotistical, I guess.
Well, it's Nellie Dean is talking in that. In fact, originally the epigraph was Nellie Dean in Wuthering Heights, but they wanted to take that out, and I think that I wanted that epigraph. My last 3 books all have a male epigraph for part 1 and a female epigraph for part 2, and I wanted that epigraph because I think what Wuthering Heights captures so brilliantly is the kind of irreducible egotism of Heathcliff and Cathy as well, and Nellie is, though in many ways a kind of generous and imaginative character, she, in that phrase, "well, we must be for ourselves in the long run," really struck a chord with me when I read it, that in fact, at the end of the day, we are. I'm living. I'm not living for anyone else. You live for yourself. And to an extent, I was perhaps trying to excuse this autobiographical turn or confessional turn, which the poems have. But I was also saying, possibly even under the illusions that one's doing things for the good of the greater world, and at the bottom of it, you're writing a poem because out of what may be classified as egotism. There's a Wallace Stevens letter in which he talks about that, and he says it quite kindly. He says at bottom it's egotism which is driving poets. So when poets say, or it's like poets or actors say it's all about giving or whatever, all that is okay, it's about giving, but actually it's about self-presentation, self-promotion, the assertion of selfhood. And Nellie, who's in some ways not a very selfish character, even she agrees that, and that somehow seemed to connect with my own. What the heck? If I want to put this down, I'm going to.
Maybe we could end with the incredibly unselfish postman who manages to deliver your letters. Is that another true story?
That's a true story. Yes, I checked that out with my brother the other day, and he confirmed it. And I have a footnote for that one as well, because it talks about letters. It's about letters being sent from boarding school after my parents had moved to Hong Kong, and we invented a building and sent them there rather than because I think they hadn't given us the address. They'd forgotten to give us, all the school, the address. And we had to write Sunday letters every Sunday after chapel. And not only did we have to write these letters, we then had to show them to the master in charge, who would scrutinise them to make sure we hadn't said anything negative. So all these letters were returned to the General Post Office because this address didn't exist. And then the postman, my parents must have received a letter from someone else, and the postman twigged to Mr. Donald Ford. Mr. Donald Ford, 9 Bowen Court, not 9977 Conway Court, or whatever it was, and put them together and delivered them all. So he was a clever postman, but he somehow, my parents probably didn't kind of read between the lines of our letters. Going off to a school when you're 8 and not seeing your parents for 8 months of the year, it's a weird experience that, and it's bound to have some effect on you, and a little bit of animosity, I suppose, comes out in that poem towards this decision taken by my parents to opt for this lifestyle which they enjoyed, but we sort of paid the cost of in some ways. And this is Hong Kong, 1973. How profusely our parents thanked the postman who finally delivered in one big batch our carefully scrutinised weekly letters addressed not to where they lived, which was 9 Bowen Hill, but to 77 Conway Court, a wholly fictitious building we'd invented. Oh, ingenious postman, you delved beneath the words we wrote and discovered what we meant.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.